Hello and welcome to this session on Search Committee Best Practices. To start, we're going to talk about your role as a committee member and the participation that is involved with that. Every committee member must actively participate throughout the entire search process. So please respect that there will be varying perspectives from your diverse group. So there must be a minimum of 3 committee members, but there may be more. Also respect that this is a group process. So when you're discussing the candidates' qualifications and how their interviews went, and things like that, make sure that you do that as a group and not in any one-on-one or side conversations, because we want to ensure that everyone's on the same page and knows who is moving forward and who isn't. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, can we divide and conquer when we review the applications? So as convenient as that may be, every committee member must review every application that we receive. This is really for that checks and balance system, because if everyone is reviewing every application, then it's very unlikely that an application would get accidentally overlooked. Also, it can be hard to admit it to ourselves, but we all have those unconscious biases. So if everyone is reviewing every applicant and you're all discussing how to move forward, we're keeping bias out of the evaluation decision. For legal accountability, remember that you're representing the university. So your actions as committee members are the actions of USI. We would also like to remind everyone that emails are considered discoverable in lawsuit litigation. So for confidentiality reasons, we ask that you do not discuss candidates through email. But if you are going to discuss candidates' qualifications, how their interviews went, and things like that, please do that in a virtual meeting or in-person meeting or over the phone and not through email. You're welcome to email the candidates to see if they're still interested in the position, schedule their interviews. You can also email your committee to schedule your meetings and discuss the interview questions that you'd like to ask, but anything like that, but please don't discuss the candidates themselves through email. So it is your all's responsibility that not only this is a fair search, but that the candidates perceive it to be that way. So the easiest way to do that is to make sure that you're selecting the candidates for their fit to the defined position criteria rather than any non-job related categories. So up here on the slide, these are all of our protected categories. Along with this, I'd like to discuss the handout interview questions allowed and illegal. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that document up for you now. This document goes into more detail about each of the protected categories and is a guide for you to know questions that you may ask and questions you cannot ask. But none of the questions that are in the may ask column are you required to ask. This is just a guide for you. But there are 2 questions that I like to highlight from this document. And the first one is, are you able to perform the duties of the job with or without accommodation? So what we recommend with this question is to provide the candidate with a copy of the job description and give them time to review it, because we want them to know all the duties and functional requirements of the job. So if they do have any questions, you guys can discuss that together. I'm really only looking for a yes or no answer to this question, though. I don't need the applicant to divulge me accommodation information during the interview. However, if they do mention that they may need an accommodation, please just let them know that if they're the selected candidate for this position, you and the HR office would work with them to see if we can provide a reasonable accommodation for them to be able to do their job. I also recommend that you include some language when you reach out to the candidates to schedule an interview. It says something like, if you require any disability-related accommodations in order to attend the interview, please let me know. A common request for virtual interviews may be to provide captions, and maybe for in-person interviews to have an accessible location, whether that's on a first level or with access to an elevator or something like that. But if you need any assistance with accommodations for the interviews, please reach out to HR and we'd be happy to assist you with that. The other question that I recommend is, can you perform specific job-related requirements such as travel, weekend or unusual hours, or extended work days? So this might not apply to all positions, but if your position works outside of the typical 8 to 4:30 schedule, then I recommend that you make candidates aware of this to see if they're still interested in the position. So I'm going to go back to our slides for now. Another question that I get asked a lot, especially for this topic, is, how can I have a personable conversation with candidates if I can't discuss any of these topics? So a couple things that I recommend here. This is just as much about the candidate evaluating us as it is about us evaluating the candidates. So, take this opportunity to talk about USI, what it's like to work here, what amenities we have, events that are on campus, anything like that. Talk about your department and maybe even other departments that you work with so they know what types of partnerships that they'll have around campus. You might even be talking to candidates that are not from the Evansville area. So you can talk about what it's like to live in or near Evansville, some of the resources that we have here. But this can be a little bit more casual, spark some personality into the conversation that isn't just straight interview questions the entire time. Candidates may offer up personal information without being prompted, and that is likely to happen. So just make sure you do not ask probing questions or write it down anywhere in your interview notes. Someone might say, oh, it's funny you asked that because the other day my son said, blah, blah, blah. Just don't ask questions like, oh, well, how old is he? Or do you have any other kids? Move on to the next topic and know that the information they just disclosed cannot be considered because it's not job related. If a candidate asks for community resources and or statistics or something like that, if you happen to know the answer, absolutely go ahead and provide that to them. If you don't know the answer, then either find out for them or help point them in the right direction so they can find it themselves. Just be mindful not to make any assumptions about why someone would be asking a particular question. Someone might ask, what are the best school districts in the area? A lot of people can associate that the best neighborhoods are nearby a good school district. So they might just be looking for a nice neighborhood to move to. But regardless, just don't ask them probing questions or consider the question that they asked in your evaluation decision. Just provide them the information or help them find it. There are a few questions on the application that HRCs and committee members do not. One of them is if the applicant requires sponsorship in order to work for the university. Sometimes an applicant may disclose their citizenship status somewhere else in their application materials. So please know that this cannot be a deciding factor on whether or not you consider this applicant. The ability to sponsor someone is decided on a case-by-case basis, and it's dependent on several things. So when you fill out the interview approval form, when you're scheduling your final round of interviews, please also send HR a list of the candidates that you're interviewing, because we'll review their applications, and if they've said that they do need sponsorship, then we'll connect with you to schedule a brief conversation with the candidate to discuss that. The keys to legal accountability are to focus on the position and the evidence that they provide to you. Also, do not use any evaluative information that's from outside of the search process. So this is my plug for social media. It is the university's practice not to use social media during the search process. I know that other companies do it, and I'm sure probably other universities do, but USI has taken the stance that they do not want to use social media. And this is a protection put in place for you all. It's very difficult to unknow something. So when you look at someone's social media pages, you're immediately alerted to a lot of those protected categories. So to be fair, consistent, and eliminate bias in the search process, please do not view applicants' social media pages. For legal liability, if you are acting in good faith and within the scope of your duties for USI, then you're covered by the university's insurance. This is just the abbreviated version of this policy. So if you'd like more information, you can reach out to the risk management office for the rest of the policy. So now let's discuss confidentiality. All selection processes must be kept confidential, and this obligation does apply even after the search process is over. Now, you might have someone say, oh, I know that Sally applied. Why didn't you interview her? So please let them know that that information is confidential and cannot be shared. You may get questions throughout the search from other interested parties. So again, please let them know that the information is confidential, cannot be shared. This is to ensure a fair and consistent search. But once a hiring decision has been made and it's approved to share, they can be notified. So all applicant information, as well as the process information, must be kept confidential. There are a couple of reasons why this is so important. Number one, when candidates look for other employment, they usually do not tell their current employer that they're looking, and they probably don't want them to find out until it's more serious into the process. So we don't want to have that reputation as a university that candidates' information is released without their permission and too soon in the process. They'd be afraid to apply to us again in the future, and they'd probably tell others that they'd also be afraid to apply to USI. So we want them to feel comfortable with us keeping their information safe and secure. Now, it's just very difficult to know who someone knows. So while you may think that you're having an innocent conversation with someone that might not even be affiliated with USI, you just never know who they know. And that information could get back to a candidate's employer, or it could even get back to another candidate. So for a fair and consistent search, we need to ensure that candidates receive information appropriately. We don't want anyone to have an unfair advantage over the rest of the applicant pool, and want to ensure that candidates are receiving the same information consistently. I do want to put a caveat to the information that I have on this slide here. It says names and materials are confidential. If it's a part of your interview process, you're inviting other groups to interview the candidates, whether that's a group of students or they're giving a presentation to the campus community or anything like that, they're probably going to want to know the name of the person they're talking to. And they're probably going to want to know a little bit about their experience that qualified them to get to this stage. So when you schedule interviews with the candidates, please tell them who they'll be meeting with and what information of theirs that you'll be sharing. So if you're planning on sharing their resume, please let them know so that if they do have any questions or concerns, they can bring those to you in advance. And on that note, if you are inviting other groups to interview your finalist candidates, we can create a Qualtrics survey to collect that feedback from them. But if you're interested in doing that, please contact HR and give us ample notice so that we can create that on time. If you do become aware of any breaches in confidentiality, you can inform your search chair, the executive or associate director of HR, or the provost for academic searches. Moving on to conflict of interest. So I have this silly little cartoon here to show that we don't want to be like Mr. Cow, who doesn't understand it's a conflict of interest for him to be selling hamburgers. So it's a couple of things to keep in mind regarding internal candidates or candidates that you personally know. So if a candidate is a relative or a friend or acquaintance that you know from the beginning that you cannot be objective, or it's someone for whom you plan to give a reference, then these are all situations that would be considered a conflict of interest. So we'd ask that you disclose the relationship and then resign from the committee. However, if someone has listed you as a reference and you still believe that you can remain objective, considering them and the rest of the applicants for this search, you can disclose that to the group and remain on the committee if they all agree that it's appropriate for you to continue. However, if you do decide to remain a reference, you'll need to resign from the committee. But if you're moving forward on the committee, we'll need to ask that applicant to immediately provide an alternative reference, informing them that since you're on the search committee, it's a conflict of interest for you to serve as a reference for them. So if the applicant is a friend or acquaintance and you believe that you can be objective, still disclose that information to the group, and then you all decide together whether or not you feel it's still appropriate to remain on the committee, knowing the relationship that you have with one or more of the candidates. If there are internal or known candidates and you've determined that it's not a conflict of interest, there's a couple of things that you need to keep in mind throughout this process. Make sure that you set aside what you think you already know about that person, whether it's positive or negative, and then do not interact with them about the search. We need to make sure that we're treating all applicants consistently and fairly. So we don't want to give anyone that we know an unfair advantage. And that's why it's important to only consider evaluative information that's presented during the search process and to ensure that they receive consistent communication just like all of the other applicants. So make sure that you review their information objectively and compare them to the position criteria, and then maintain that objectivity when you're comparing the known candidate to the other candidates that you don't already know. So I'd like to kind of briefly discuss evaluation criteria and rubrics. For the initial selection rubric, make sure that you include all of the minimum requirements, and then you can add some preferences as well. Just make sure that what you add can be found through their application materials. So if you need someone with great presentation skills, that would be difficult to evaluate based on their application materials and be better suited to judge during their interview. But please do not use numbers to score your evaluation criteria on that initial selection rubric. That makes it look like the minimum requirements are weighted when actually they're equal to each other. So what I mean by that is that if you have a master's degree required and 3 years of experience, they have to meet both of those criteria in order to be qualified. Now, if they do not meet one of those, then they cannot be considered moving forward. So instead, they recommend to use alpha coding like meets, does not meet, exceeds, something along those lines. So I'd like to go ahead and pull up an example of an initial selection rubric to explain what I mean by this. So for this rubric, I have the minimum requirements highlighted in yellow and a preference highlighted in blue. So for this first candidate, we can see that they do not meet one of the minimum requirements. So that automatically makes them not qualified. But while the second candidate might meet all of the qualifications, the third candidate actually exceeds one. So maybe they automatically move to our top list. Now, in this note section, I do recommend that you add more detail here to help you remember each candidate. So, you know, who you want to recommend to the committee to interview, but this is just a really quick example. Your rubric is not required to look like this. This is just an example. This is just a recommendation that I have, but you can use the format that works best for your group. But this particular format can be a really easy way to look at all of the applicants and compare them in one page. I'm going to pull my slides back up for us now. So when we talk about interviewing, the EEOC has a couple of requirements. These must be valid and reliable employment tests. So we must be uniform in all our screening and selection methods and structure the interview process to maintain consistency. So, you know, take a look at the job description and think about what the candidates need to be successful in this role. So what do they need to have experience with, knowledge on, or the skills necessary to be able to train them in a reasonable time frame so that they can be successful in this role. And those are your critical success factors. And that's what you want to use to create your interview questions. We do also ask you to please make sure you're asking the same questions for each candidate to maintain that consistency and fairness. And we also recommend using mostly behavioral interview questions. And so research proves that behavioral questions are the best predictors of success. This decreases those canned practice responses. Instead, it increases your chance of getting active evidence of their performance versus what they've claimed about on their application. So behavioral questions ask candidates to relate their past performance to how they'd perform if they were selected for this role. You want to make sure that you focus those around those critical success factors that we just talked about. So behavioral questions often start with phrases like, describe a time when, tell us about a situation in which, give us an example of. These do often contain follow-up questions. You know, everyone answers a little differently, and you might need more detail to fully assess that information. So, you know, it might just be as simple as asking for another example, or, you know, how did that change that program going forward, or what did you do to ensure that this didn't happen again? You know, things like that to clarify their answer or to get some more detail. So again, recommend to develop these behavioral questions by tying them to the critical success factors that you've identified and then maintain consistency throughout this process. So I want to give you a couple examples of behavioral questions. So this first one here says, tell us about a challenge you have faced in developing the administrative abilities of someone who reported to you in a chair or similar role. Please describe what the challenge was, what you tried, and what you learned from the situation. So this is a great example to show a detailed question that helps a candidate relate what they did in the past and how they would perform for us. But as great and detailed as this question is, I like to offer a little interview tip. So some candidates may get nervous and have a hard time remembering every piece of a large question like this. So you might want to consider breaking it into pieces and pre-plan follow-up questions in case they need those prompts. You know, some people will give all that detail without being prompted, while others might need it. So just have it prepared just in case. So this next example, in your current role as whatever that may be, describe any steps you've taken that changed the way in which students perceive your college or program. And you might want to follow up with, how did you measure those changes? Another detailed question helps you to evaluate the candidate. But there is another document, and it's called Search Committee Guidelines. It has example behavioral questions on the last 4 or 5 pages. And you're welcome to use any of those questions if you'd like. Edit those questions. They're there for you as a resource. This is our affirmative action statement. So we must have either this entire paragraph or we have a tagline that's shorter. And that information must be included in any job ads that we send out. Faculty positions must be posted for a minimum of 30 days, and admin positions must be posted for a minimum of 21 days. Any candidates that you interview, and definitely any candidates that you hire, must meet all of the minimum required qualifications. So if you think you don't have a good pool of qualified candidates, reach out to HR to see if we can provide any help with active recruitment. But also think about any organizations that we could advertise the job to, or anywhere that you may be a member of that could share this information. As you go through the search process, keep good notes on who moves forward and who does not. We do notify all applicants once a hiring decision has been made, and we want to ensure that we send the appropriate communication. So I don't want to send an email saying, thank you for meeting with us if you've never reached out to that candidate. So at the end of the search, a representative from HR will reach out to the search chair with a spreadsheet of all the applicants and ask that you help us identify the appropriate communication to send to everyone. But if candidates are withdrawing from the search or withdrawing from an offer, and you have the opportunity to ask them what led to that decision, please do. We're tracking that information to identify any trends. So if you can get that information, please forward it to the HR office. Any documentation for the search must be kept for at least 3 years after the search closes. This includes rubrics, your interview notes, feedback notes, anything like that. But then after the 3-year retention period, the documents can be confidentially shredded. And if you do not have access to confidential shredding, please contact HR so that we can assist you with this. In summary, please respect that this is a group process. Maintain that legal accountability and confidentiality throughout the process. Create uniform and structured selection processes, building them around those critical success factors and using behavioral questions. And then use quality reference checking techniques, which I know we didn't talk about, but you can find that information about references in the Search Committee Guidelines document. So best of luck to you as you search for the best candidate for your department and USI. If you have any questions throughout your search, please contact the HR office. Our phone number is 812-464-1815. Thank you for your time.